It's the week ending Saturday, the 30th of June, and this is The Week Unwrapped, sponsored by Barclays Corporate Banking. In the past 7 days, we've seen Germany exiting the World Cup in the first round, President Erdogan winning another term in office, and Boris Johnson skipping the vote on a new Heathrow runway. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team are Kari Wilkin, Jamie Timson and Hollie Clemence. And starting the show this week is Hollie. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is this the week when poverty tourism became unacceptable?
I've got a latte and 4 chocolate croissants. So far, it is maybe nearly 2 p.m, so it is lunchtime. However, for a breakfast, I've got 4 croissants and a coffee. I'm winning right now, guys. I'm doing good. If you have any confidence in me today, if you believe that I'm gonna succeed, give the video a thumbs up now, guys. Just smash it. I want to see how many of you actually believe that I'm gonna do well. Just remember, so far I've got a coffee and 4 chocolate croissants. I'm winning. Give the video a thumbs up, let me know.
YouTube sensation Alfie Days, on a controversial video he uploaded but was then quickly taken back down again. Hollie, why?
It says Alfie Days wandering around Waitrose, wondering why it's so expensive as he tries to live off a pound. He came under criticism, particularly this week, from Jack Monroe, who writes in an article for The Independent saying that gimmicks like this are nothing more than poorface or poverty tourism that holds no value but to entertain. And she says it even shows disdain of poor people.
And that was the general criticism of the video, wasn't it? People saying this is poverty tourism for entertainment, saying, oh, what would it be like to live on a pound? And that demeans people whose life that actually is.
And there's other things as well. There's St Paul's private school that came under fire, where pupils paid £8,000 a term. They had an austerity day where they kind of swapped their herb-encrusted salmon for potatoes and pretended to be poor. Whereas I think a few years ago, maybe that would have gone under the radar. But this time, everyone kind of outraged by it, thinking this is uncomfortable now.
It seems extraordinary, though. It's the internet, isn't it? It seems extraordinary we're in a world where we know what St Paul's school are doing as part of their, educational let's find out about poor people week.
So this week, the phrase has really kind of gained popularity, although some people have accused her of the association with blackface has come under fire, which she's defended herself on Thursday morning on Twitter. She's apologised for causing any offence, but says it's still her way of explaining that a marginalised group has been misrepresented by people who feel their voices are more value.
She's trying to say, Kari, isn't she, with the comparison with blackface, that this is as hurtful to people living in poverty, someone with lots of money pretending to be poor, as someone doing blackface and pretending to be black for entertainment. But is that valid, really? It was clear, even just from the clip we just played, that what he was doing really was seeing how much he could blag as a celebrity. Yeah. He wasn't really saying what's it like to live in a tower block on no money.
And he's turning it into, it's all about him. How well can I do? He's not actually looking at, what it is like to live in poverty. I think it's turning it into a game and into entertainment, and it's definitely patronising. On the other hand, there are valid charitable initiatives that do give people the experience. Obviously, it's not like being in poverty, because poverty is unending, or certainly long term. There's no hope. That's the point. It's the lack of hope that makes poverty real. But there are charitable initiatives such as Live Below the Line, where people, I think it's taking place in quite a few countries worldwide now, where people live on £1 a day for 5 days. And at least that gives you an insight, a little bit of real appreciation for what it's like, because people always say, oh, you can eat well on £1, if you just buy lots of fruit and vegetables. Well, it's, when you actually try and do that, no, it's not easy. And at least it gives us a bit more empathy.
Jamie, does it give people empathy, or is it right that we call time on this sort of awareness campaign, even if that's not what Alfie was doing?
I think I can't see a reason to keep doing these kind of things. I think the main idea and perhaps what I would want is to amplify the voices of people who are poor. And the way that you do that is by talking to them and listening to them and giving them platforms to speak and tell people what it's like to live on the breadline. Poverty is rising. At the moment, there's 1.5 million people in the UK that are defined as being poor. But there isn't that many platforms. You know, you think about things like Benefit Street in 2014, which was a Channel 4 documentary that really highlighted and kind of glamorized the kind of criminal activities that were going on by them, rather than by a minority, exactly. And there just isn't a voice out there for Jack Monroe is one of the few people who regularly does try and get people to understand. And I think things like living below the poverty line and this £1 a day, one of my favourite things about the whole £1 a day videos thing about Alfie Days was that the next day when he took it down and he did this apology video saying that, oh, I've got things wrong, you know, maybe it was bad. His only big criticism was that he wanted people to know that he wasn't a Tory. He said, I've seen a lot of comments saying that I'm a Tory, and let me tell you guys, I'm not a Tory. He didn't say who he was voting for, he didn't say anything else, he just didn't want to be a Tory. So actually maybe he's a man after my own heart.
I think also the other thing we can do is push for political changes to legislation that is penalising people for being poor.
Yeah, I think the real thing is if you want to support poor people, maybe not having austerity days where you eat baked potatoes and pretend that that's some form of terrible lunch, but maybe do support things like the living wage campaign, people paying a correct amount of money to the people for their jobs. Look at your MP and think, poverty can befall anyone at any time. Each one of us is only 2 or 3 steps away from losing our job, becoming sick, ending up on the breadline. So you look at your MPs and you say, are you the type of person that's going to be able to defend me and push for the best legislation if I were to be poor, sick, infirm?
The outrage, some outrage a couple of months ago when Conservative MP Adam Holloway, who's a former army officer, he spent a week on the streets, living rough on the streets for a documentary, and then said during a parliamentary debate that sleeping rough was actually a lot more comfortable than military exercises, and that able-bodied people could make quite a lot of money from begging on the streets of London. And he said this a day after a study had revealed that at least 79 homeless people had died on Britain's streets or in temporary accommodation in the previous 6 months. And just the lack of insight that, you know, you lived on the street for a week, you knew you were going home to a warm bed and a shower, you had a documentary team looking over you to make sure that you weren't attacked or robbed or worse. It's just a staggering lack of empathy, and we should be targeting MPs like him because they're the ones making the rules that keep people in poverty.
So, but does that mean then that this technique that, you know, serious journalists often use, Polly Toynbee, the Guardian columnist, once spent a month as a low-paid worker, for example, and went on benefits so that she could write about it. Does that mean that should end? Because there is something in experiential journalism, isn't it? If journalists write well about it and say they acknowledge that they're going back to a comfy home at the end of it, but they wanted to see what it was like, what's wrong with that?
I'm not saying there's necessarily anything wrong with that in itself. I'm just saying it's as though he didn't seem to acknowledge the fact that his experience was actually radically
understood in that
different.
case, but moving out of that, is this you seem to be saying, Holly, this maybe should be the end of that technique, and I'm saying, does that technique have some legitimacy?
I think what Jack Monroe would argue is that doesn't take into account the psychological difficulties of someone that's actually in poverty who can't see the end of the week. It's going to end and they're going to go back and live in their 4-bedroom mansion somewhere. She's saying there's like suicide risks, depression, all the other things that come with it. You can't just walk into that, try that on and walk away and pretend that you really know what it's like to be in poverty.
It's that key lack of hope, isn't it? That's the difference.
Okay, and moving away from this sort of subject of poor face and back to Alfie and YouTubers in general, if he wasn't trying to make a point about poverty and he wasn't trying to raise money, he was actually just reflecting what it's like to be him, which is he can walk into Waitrose and get 4 free chocolate croissants. Was there anything wrong with that?
But he's dressing it up as some sort of...
Can I live on a pound?
I think the problem
So
comes
it's a lapse in taste, but
problem,
he's being himself.
The problem comes with the idea of challenges in general. You know, he's got to create content every day for his followers. He's got to come up with ways to get people to click the, as he says in the clip, thumbs up, and if he's smashing it.
Smash it.
So the issue there is that these challenges exist and are created, you know, be it who can eat the most hot dogs or who can live on a pound for a day. And you can see there the problem is, one is, I mean, I've created this dichotomy, but I'm going to keep going with it.
Sure.
One is you eat...
You're smashing it.
Yeah. One is you eat the hot dogs and that's all fun. And the other one is that you're only spending a pound every day. And one of them doesn't represent poverty at all in the slightest, whereas one of them is attempting to. But I do agree that if he had dressed it up in a different way, so if he just said, oh, I'm doing this kind of like fun thing of like seeing how much free stuff I can get,
yes,
everyone would just be like, all right, mate, cool. You're smashing it.
So it's just a lapse of taste. Because in the hot dog example, right, and this will sound ridiculous, but in the hot dog example, if you eat 100 hot dogs and then you're sick on camera and everyone thinks it's jolly entertaining, you could imagine, couldn't you, that groups of people that are addicted to food would say, well, you're trivialising the issue of people being sick or people with eating disorders. I mean, there comes a point where you say, no, this is an entertainment channel. I'm not trying to do anything beyond entertain people.
The problem is the lack of taste is kind of pervasive. It's everywhere. If you look at fashion, there's been like scenes from Zoolander have literally come to life with like, Vivienne Westwood. She put her models in frostbitten makeup to show them in homeless outfits. Urban Outfitters CEO once described his target shopper as upscale homeless. Like, it's become everywhere in fashion and television. You've got Vicky Pollard, and I think what Jack Monroe's trying to say is that then people need to rethink that. You maybe wouldn't do that. You wouldn't do that now with blackface. You wouldn't have a black character being funny purely because they're black. And I think she's trying to say there's not humour in someone just being poor, or just because you're showing someone pretending to be poor, it's not acceptable anymore.
Jamie, you're up next. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Was this the week we caught the wolf at the door?
The Department of Justice secretly seized a year's worth of phone and email records from a reporter at the New York Times, the paper said Thursday. In a letter sent to Times reporter Olly Watkins, federal prosecutors notified her they obtained her email and phone records from Google and Verizon.
CBS News reporting this week on files taken by the US government from a New York Times reporter. Jamie, why did they do that?
So the FBI this week arrested recently retired security director called James Wolfe. As part of that investigation, so federal prosecutors were charging him with lying to investigators about contacts with reporters. As part of that arresting of James Wolfe, they seized the phone records of Olly Watkins, who is a reporter currently for the New York Times, but she has also worked for Politico and BuzzFeed in the past. On Sunday, the New York Times posted a long report into the work of Olly Watkins, and it's quite a salacious report. The paper itself was criticised for focusing on the affair that Watkins had with Wolfe, a 3-year-long affair, but the wider story is about federal overreach. So as the clip says, of the taking of a reporter's phone and emails to gain their contacts by the president, basically.
Kari, Trump's been very open about his dislike of the press, actually the New York Times in particular. Does this development mean anything, or is it just emblematic of that?
I think he's clearly going after anyone who threatens his regime, if you like. I don't imagine he'd have gone after this reporter if she'd been posting stories about how great he was. And he told reporters that the FBI had arrested a very important leaker, obviously referring to Wolfe. This ties into his whole claims about fake news, about stories being leaked, about him being set up. So yeah, I think this is very clearly ties into his agenda.
There's another aspect of the story which comes into this, which was that the reason that Watkins and her relationship with Wolfe stopped or ended was because she was approached by a man called Jeffrey Rambo, who, a great surname for this type of thing, who was, it appears to be freelancing. He was freelancing for the FBI at a time when he was working for the Border Patrol. And he came to her when the affair wasn't known, so she hadn't told anyone. He came to her and said, I'm working on this investigation into leaking. I am aware that you are having an affair with this man. And then he told her about a holiday that she had taken, like the details of a holiday that she had taken recently, to prove that he had knowledge about who she was. The theory at the moment, because it's very, very unlikely that Rambo was working by himself in that regard. And the theory is that Trump or the Trump administration had sent Rambo to basically scare Watkins into working with the government. And so there is a real question over whether the Trump administration now is really clamping down on press freedoms in the US.
It all sounds like an episode of House of Cards, doesn't it? I mean, the sort of intrigue behind the scenes. But Holly, we've seen similar-ish things in this country in the sense that if you think back to the phone hacking scandal and the obvious connections there turned out to be between, well, it was mostly the new Labour government at that time, wasn't it, but also the early Conservative coalition government and the Murdochs, for example, it's common, isn't it, in democracies that the press and the political class are, as in this case, literally in bed with each other. So, it's just thrown a light on something that we know is going on anyway. Is it anything new?
I mean, this has happened in previous administrations and in different countries. I'm not sure it's specific to Trump, but I think what you need to look at, or kind of maybe from our point of view as journalists, is our responsibilities to report something like that and have a reporter that's having such a relationship. Yes, they do go on, but maybe it's the onus on the newspaper itself and the editors to be aware of such a relationship and them take steps to make sure the reporter's reporting on the right beats. Maybe she shouldn't have been reporting on that area. It's up to the newspaper itself. It feels a little bit like they've kind of hung her out to dry.
And it's not up to the journalist himself or herself to say, I'm in a relationship with someone that I'm writing about, so I shouldn't be?
She did. She told her editors, and they decided that, but she said, I'm not using him as a source, and they decided that they were happy with her journalistic integrity. So I think the onus is really on the editors, whether they made the right call, and on Wolf. It does seem that this woman is very much being essentially accused of selling sex in return for inside scoops. No one is looking at this guy who's gone after a series of young reporters from the sound of it. He'd been sending suggestive texts when he broke up with this woman. Yes, he's been arrested, but why is everyone attacking her?
I also wonder if they would be different if she was a similar age to him, if they were married, if there'd been multiple stories of massive public interest, if there was a scoop and she had used him as a source, but it was something that was so crucial that it changed everybody's lives. There's so many context to it is quite important. I think maybe she's been sold out because she's younger, because they weren't in a married relationship.
One of the stories that she wrote at the time, while she was in this relationship, and she claims that, as Kari said, she claims that she didn't use Wolf as a source, but one of the stories that she wrote was about Carter Page, a former Trump advisor who had interactions with the Russian government previous to Trump being elected. And that was a widely celebrated story. And so partly I think there is an element of the newspapers wanting to continue to use a reporter who has really great sources, who is making really great stories, and not really being that bothered about the relations that she has if she has been telling them. There is also another aspect which I think is quite worrying, which is that all of this focus on her and her relationship and the kind of salacious nature of it is hiding from the kind of the federal overreach. In a way, the Trump administration has gone above and beyond what people would normally think was okay by seizing her records, particularly as a journalist, but has then tricked or made it so that the newspapers are all reporting on the relationship rather than what they're actually doing.
Smoke and mirrors, isn't it? Because this woman did uncover some major scoops. Also, shortly before the affair began, her reporting led to a series that revealed that the CIA was spying on the Intelligence Committee. But that's just sort of got buried down the story because it's not as sexy as a sort of young reporter has an affair with this married, older, very important political figure, and they've twisted the story around.
So is this a turning point, Jamie, because this is going to happen increasingly with Trump as president, or is it a turning point because it's been brought to the attention of the press and the public that this is happening, and therefore we might be more guarded against it happening again?
I hope it's the latter. I think probably what's going to happen is that if Trump sees that he can get away with doing this, it's all about keeping his head above the parapet and making sure that the news that does get out about what the Trump administration is doing is broadly okay to what they want to do. I also think that it's eroding people's trust in the media. The reaction from the right-wing conservative news organizations, people like Fox News and even further right than that, has been to say, well, look, kind of classic. A reporter, the media, literally in bed with Washington establishment people. How can we trust what the New York Times is reporting? How can we trust what these people are? This is the swamp, that he always talked about, that he wanted to drain. Unfortunately, and particularly unfortunately as a journalist, this could be an example or a turning point of people just no longer trusting them. And
no longer believing, actually, that journalists can genuinely be impartial. I mean, you get a glimpse of this, don't you, in the UK with the reporters who are on the BBC or the presenters. I mean, I think of Andrew Neil, for example, who used to edit the Sunday Times. People know that. And so even when he is rigorously impartial, presenting programmes like This Week or The Daily Politics, if you go on Twitter, you will see attacks from the left that suggest that he's betraying some right-wing bias. That it's not really possible in public life anymore to be a journalist without people saying, oh yeah, but she slept with him.
I don't think anyone can be entirely objective. You know, even when you're choosing which stories to present, let alone how to present them, that's your innate bias of prioritising what's important. I think people have got a more sophisticated understanding of journalism now, so that they are more questioning of the angles that are being taken on stories. And I'm not sure that's a bad thing in itself. But obviously it does leave journalists in a much more precarious position. You can find just the facts that you choose to report, you can be accused of bias. And the people who don't come out well from one side of a story can always use that.
I think transparency is the key. I think if you know that Andrew Neil is chair of the Spectator Group, if you know that Andrew Marr has edited The Independent in the past, I think then that's fine. You can make a decision about who you listen to and media literacy and choosing and being critically engaging with sources. But if people hide their allegiances or hide their past, that's when there's a problem.
Maybe that is the future of journalism, having a little sidebar that explains. I was having a quick look at IPSO, Independent Press Standards Organisation. There's no thou shalt not sleep with thy sources rules. But if you look at like the Guardian's editorial guidelines, they say do not mention a relative or partner in your article if you're a journalist, even if they're an expert in the field. If you have to, that connection should be made clear. But that seems like good guidelines to me. Just make it explicitly clear that you slept with the person you're writing about.
Kari, you're next. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
I think it's the week we ask, will the meek really inherit the earth?
You know, I just left Trump National Doral in Miami, and it's a great place. I just spent $250 million rebuilding it, making it the best resort in the country.
Even the really dishonest press says Trump's people are the most incredible. When it comes to great steaks, I've just raised the stakes. Trump steaks are the world's greatest steaks, and I mean that in every sense of the word.
You know who that was. In a compilation created by the Media Today channel on YouTube. Kari, why are we talking about him?
Well, this week, a leading Australian psychologist diagnosed Donald Trump as a malignant narcissist. I don't think this is particularly breaking news in itself. But what is interesting is that a new study this week found that people with an inflated sense of self-worth tend to get ahead in life, basically, because they're mentally tough. Researchers studied more than 300 secondary school pupils at schools in Italy who had been identified as narcissists.
Actually medically diagnosed as narcissists.
They were a bit hazy about that bit, but yeah. And found that they tended to score much better in exams than they would have expected from other tests of their intelligence. And the study leader then argued that although narcissism is considered to be a socially malevolent trait, if you put sort of conventional social morality aside, perhaps we should look at it as a very positive trait, which is a view that I personally take issue with.
Go on then, take issue with it.
Well, I think a positive trait, but for who? I think it's certainly not necessarily positive for society. I think Trump encapsulates that argument.
Well, you see, Trump encapsulates that argument perhaps as president, but you could argue that as head of the Trump Organization, he made lots of money for the people who work for him, so he helped those people by being a narcissist.
But what damage?
Employment's going up. There's more job opportunities for black and Latinos. I'm just saying. But also,
are narcissists necessarily even happy? Because to be happy, they need constant affirmation, and you're never going to constantly get that. And although narcissists are very charming, and tend to do very well socially, they also gradually drive people away. So it's a cycle that is ultimately going to break down.
Holly, do you think we're in danger of confusing self-belief and self-confidence with narcissism? Narcissism getting bandied around a lot.
That it is used probably more than it medically needs to be. But there's a lot of philosophical theories, and psychologists have looked at it in detail. And I think I like the idea that there's a scale of narcissism, and a little bit is actually quite good for you if you've got self-belief. Holden's not here this week, but let's return to Aristotle. And he used to say...
Wondering where you were going there.
We need our history lesson.
He's risen through the ranks thanks to his... Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was looking back at Aristotle's view on self-love and selfishness, and he thought you can be selfish, but in a good way, and use it for the greater good of others. And I think that is what you could bring forward with narcissists if they can succeed, but also everyone could be a little bit more self-loving. It wouldn't be the end of the world, but I think the actual medical term for narcissist probably isn't a positive.
Well, apparently there are 3 distinct types of narcissists that are widely recognised. There's the grandiose narcissist, which is basically Trump. There's the vulnerable narcissist who are more reserved, they have a sense of entitlement, and they easily feel threatened or demeaned by other people's actions. And then there's actual narcissistic personality disorder, which is a much more extreme form, and it's a classified psychological disorder. And they think estimates are that it affects about 1% to 2% of the population, mostly men apparently. I think when we talk about the sort of the explosion of narcissism in modern Western society, we're not talking about the disorder, but the rise of narcissistic traits. You know, yes, I agree with Holly that a certain level of self-love is definitely a good thing. It's when it tips into this belief that you are perfect, that you are extraordinary. We all want to be extraordinary in our society at the same time as wanting to belong. And obviously most people aren't extraordinary. It's just reality.
It's quite another scary theory that goes with that is that narcissism and evolution, because they're very sexually coercive, probably attractive, charming. Narcissists are going around spreading their seed, and that's why we're having more narcissism in society.
It's not hereditary, is it?
Apparently
partly upbringing, partly hereditary.
That is fascinating.
I don't think they found the actual specific gene, but
with the Trump thing, we don't often say the T word on the Week Unwrapped because we're focused on unreported stories. But since we are talking about President Trump and we've linked him into this story, this diagnosing him from afar business, you know, it is interesting, isn't it, to speculate exactly what is going on in that brain very often when he's giving public speeches, because you do wonder as a human being why he's talking in that way, even if you agreed with his policy. Is there a danger that actually by diagnosing from afar, which of course clinical psychologists will not medically do because they say, well, I haven't assessed him personally, but a lot of people who basically have degrees in the subject but aren't necessarily psychologists as such practicing will. Is there a danger that by doing that, we're actually taking away that he might just be a bit of an arse? You know, we're saying, oh, it's because he's a narcissist, it's because he has this condition. And actually, you know, it takes away the ability for someone to say, no, he's just being an arse.
I don't think they're actually saying that he's got the actual psychological disorder. I think they're just saying that he exhibits a lot of narcissistic traits.
I also don't think it's very helpful. Like, it's not very helpful to do something like that because I think it others them, or whoever you're talking about, and creates a kind of a divide where you suddenly start going dismissive. You start saying, well, that he's just like that because of this, and therefore he can continue to behave that way. You're not socialising someone if you say, well, they are this, so therefore you have to treat them differently. It doesn't just work with Trump, it works with anyone in, I think, any society when you overdiagnose and you say, well, they've got this problem, and so therefore we're going to go and treat them. And that's not to say that people shouldn't be treated differently. Of course that's true, but I do think that we are too quick to diagnose as issues things that perhaps before we were happy to socialise in. For the record, I actually don't think there's that much of a problem with having having narcissists in our society. I think actually a lot of probably the people that you would think of as having moved society forward were probably narcissists. You don't get into that situation or that position without thinking that what you're doing is really great, and that might be for the detriment of the other people around you. You only have to look at what an arsehole Gandhi was to think, actually,
Maybe ready with a controversial quip.
that actually maybe we aren't so far away from that kind of society. We're not all that different, and I think society does need people like, I don't want to say Trump, but we need people who people like that as much.
Less controversial example perhaps than Gandhi is we're sitting in the building of Dennis Publishing at the moment, right? Named after Felix Dennis, who did lots of good things for charity, but clearly was, you know, a very egocentric person who named this organisation after himself, and yet here we are all employed by it.
Yeah, and Holden's going to change the name of the week to Holden.
Yeah.
So Holden Online.
I agree that narcissists do a lot of good, and I think there definitely is a positive side to it. I think what's more worrying is just the growth of the collective ego that everyone wants to sort of, you know, look at the rise of selfies. It's all look at me generation and this sort of era of the ego. I think that's what we need to be careful of. And I think it can also lead to a lot of people becoming very depressed because everyone wants to feel extraordinary and to sort of have all these followers on social media, and we're looking for constant affirmation. And I think it can actually cause a lot of unhappiness, this rise of this focus on the self.
Not everyone is equipped for it, you know, and I suppose that's what you were saying, Holly, wasn't it, about the actual proportion of narcissists in culture, and yet, as Kari's pointing out, our technology is telling us to all be self-centred.
I think we're definitely living in an era of individualism, and that's kind of connected in that we all look at ourselves first, which is fine.
That's natural,
but yeah, there's definitely a limit, and
yet we also have this contradictory need to belong. So we want to stand out, but also to belong. It does seem that this is spreading. There was a recent study where there's something called the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, which I took. And apparently,
Rosenberg was such a narcissist. He had to name everything after himself.
Named it after him, yeah.
Seriously.
But sort of perfect self-esteem is in what's considered healthy and normal is 15 to 25%. Researchers, they studied high school and college students for 2 decades up until 2008. And they found that by 2008, 1 in 5 college students scored a perfect 40, as in they felt that they could not get any better.
That's great.
And that level...
That's great. Think about what they can achieve.
All these entitled people going out there going, no, I deserve everything. No, it should all be about me.
I don't want people
not going to
leaving.
become obstructive?
I don't want people leaving college going, well, actually, I can't achieve anything. If you come out of college,
but that would put them into the healthy range. I can achieve, but it's not as though the world has cheated me if I don't get everything.
I think you can just achieve so much more if the sky's the limit.
Is that how you got here, Jamie?
Look at me.
Enormous self-belief. Yeah. Well, that is it from this edition of The Jamie Timson Show. My thanks to Kari Wilkin and Hollie Clemence, who were mere guests. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to The Week Unwrapped. It helps us find new listeners. It helps us improve the show. Speaking of which, this Monday, we will send you our first ever bonus business podcast. That comes courtesy of our friends at Barclays Corporate Banking. You can get it all delivered straight to your phone when you subscribe to The Week Unwrapped for free on your podcast app of choice, or you can listen at theweek.co.uk/The Week Unwrapped. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.